The Adulteration of Food and Drink Act. During the Victorian era, arsenic was used in medicines, candles, wallpaper, household items, and even food colorings. It was also used as a poison for murder. In the city of Bradford, England, a man named William Hardaker sold sweets in the town center. He bought his ingredients from a man named Joseph Neal. These sweets were peppermint lozenges made from a mixture of peppermint oil, sugar, water, and gum. The mixture was formed into a paste, dried on boards, and then cut into lozenge-shaped pieces. Food adulteration was common in Britain as a way of reducing costs, and for this reason, Neal replaced part of the sugar with powdered gypsum. A few days before the Saturday market, Neal was due to make a batch of sweets for Hardaker, but he had run out of gypsum. Neal asked his tenant, James Archer, to visit a pharmacy about 5 miles away and purchase some gypsum. The pharmacist, Charles Hodgson, was confined to bed due to illness, and his assistant, William Goddard, who had only been working for him for a few weeks, was there. Goddard had been told that the gypsum was stored in a barrel in the attic. Goddard went up to the attic and took 12 pounds, about 5 kilograms, of powder from one of the barrels. But he did not know that there were two nearly identical barrels there. In fact, he had taken powder from a barrel of arsenic trioxide, a barrel that had the label arsenic only on its underside. Neal enlisted the help of James Appleton, an experienced confectioner, to prepare the sweets. While working, both men noticed that this batch was different from the usual ones. Appleton felt that the mixture was softer and more fluid than normal, and both men also noticed that the product appeared darker than usual. Appleton, who was in direct contact with the arsenic, became ill and developed severe symptoms of poisoning, while Neal, who occasionally tasted the sweets to check their quality, also began vomiting. However, neither of them realized that their illness was connected to the sweets. When Hardaker collected the sweets from Neal, he noticed that their color was different from usual. But despite this, he managed to negotiate a lower price and bought them for a halfpenny, less than the normal rate. Hardaker also ate some of the sweets himself and became ill by 5:30 p.m., then went home and left the stall in the care of his assistant, who continued working until the market closed at 11:30 p.m. By that time, about 1,000 of the sweets had been sold. The following morning, the local police were informed of the deaths of one man and two boys, but it was initially believed that cholera was the cause. At the time, arsenic poisoning was often mistaken for cholera because both produced similar symptoms, such as vomiting, abdominal pain, and diarrhea. And England was also in the midst of a cholera epidemic. When more deaths were reported later that same day, the police began investigating the case. During the investigation, officers discovered a connection between the sweets and the deaths, visited Hardaker, and seized the remaining sweets, then went to Neal's premises and collected additional pieces of the sweets. The officers then went with Archer to the pharmacy to question Hodgson. When Archer pointed out the barrel from which the powder had been taken, Hodgson immediately recognized that it contained arsenic. After that, the police also arrested the pharmacy assistant, Goddard. By noon the following day, the death toll had reached 21, and the number of people who had fallen ill had reached 200. These deaths led the public and politicians to call for laws that would prevent similar incidents from happening again. As a result, the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act was passed, prohibiting the sale of adulterated or contaminated food, and providing penalties for those who sold adulterated products as pure goods. The Arsenic Act was also passed. Arsenic could only be sold to adults. Each sale had to be recorded in a register and signed by both the seller and the buyer, and arsenic intended for non-medicinal use had to be mixed with substances such as soot or indigo so that it could be distinguished from other white powders. The 911 emergency system. In the early morning of March 13th, 1964, Kitty Genovese, a 28-year-old woman who lived in the Queens neighborhood of New York City, was on her way home. She was a bar manager, and that night she was returning home late from work. Around 3:15 a.m., she arrived at her home and parked her car about 30 meters away from the building entrance. As she approached her building, a man named Winston Mosley attacked her. Kitty screamed and called for help. Her voice was heard by several neighbors. One of the neighbors shouted, "Leave that girl alone," and the attacker fled. Kitty managed to struggle and made her way to the back of the building, moving out of sight of the neighbors. Witnesses saw that the attacker got into his car, left, and returned about 10 minutes later. He then searched around the building again and found Kitty, who was lying injured in a rear hallway of the building. Because the door in that area was locked, she had been unable to get inside the building. There, away from the sight of others, he attacked her again, stole $49 from her, and fled. The attacks in total lasted about 30 minutes. In the end, Kitty died on the way to the hospital. In an initial report published a few days later in the New York Times, it was claimed that 38 people had witnessed the incident and that no one had intervened or called the police. However, later investigations showed that this account was not accurate. All of those people had not witnessed the full event. Some had only heard sounds. Even some actual calls to the police had been made. But at that time, the emergency system in the United States was fragmented and slow. There was no nationwide coordination. Before 911, people had to dial separate 7-digit local numbers for police or fire departments in each city, which were different everywhere. Many people did not know these numbers or could not remember them in emergency situations. Following these events, U.S. government agencies concluded that the country needed a single emergency number, a simple and fast number for all critical situations. In the late 1960s, the number 911 was eventually chosen because it was short, easy to remember, and had not been used in the telephone system at that time. The Life Safety Code. The Weinkauf Hotel, which is known today as the Ellis Hotel, opened in 1913 and was one of the tallest buildings in Atlanta, Georgia at the time. Guest rooms were located from the 3rd to the 15th floor, and each floor typically had 15 rooms. At that time, having multiple stairways in tall buildings was gradually becoming common, but under Atlanta's building codes of 1911, some buildings could still be constructed with only one staircase, and the Weinkauf Hotel had only one main stairway. Although the building's steel frame was protected with concrete and fireproof tiles, and the hotel advertised itself as being absolutely fireproof, the interior of the building was far from safe. The corridor walls were covered with fabric wall coverings, and some rooms had as many as 7 layers of wallpaper applied one over another. As a result, the interior of the building was highly combustible. The hotel was equipped with a central fire alarm system that had to be activated manually from the front desk, and each floor also had fire hoses, but no automatic sprinkler system was installed in the building. The Weinkauf Hotel was only 2 blocks away from several fire stations, and one fire company could reach the hotel in just 30 seconds. However, the hotel was unusually crowded that night, because people from across the state had traveled to Atlanta for Christmas shopping. The fire originated in the west corridor of the 3rd floor, where a mattress and a chair had been temporarily placed near the stairway. A lit cigarette that had probably fallen onto the floor likely ignited the mattress or other combustible materials in the corridor. At about 3:15 a.m., the fire broke out on the 3rd floor of the hotel. It was said that the night manager first tried to warn guests about the fire by telephone, and then, at 3:42 a.m., made the only recorded call to the fire department. However, the building's fire alarm was never activated, although by then escape from the upper floors had become nearly impossible. The first fire engines and ladder trucks arrived at the scene only 30 seconds after the call, but by that time some guests had already begun jumping from the windows to escape the fire. The fire ladders reached only part of the building's height, and many guests were rescued by this means. Others managed to escape by crossing ladders that had been placed horizontally between the hotel and the adjacent building. Nevertheless, the fire spread through nearly all of the building's floors, except for the top 2. Many guests opened their windows to escape the smoke and call for help, but doing so allowed more air to enter the building and intensified the fire. Some guests tied bed sheets together in an attempt to climb down the building. Others tried to reach the building across the narrow 3-meter alley behind the hotel, but they were unsuccessful. Firefighters climbed neighboring buildings and made their way into the hotel in order to fight the fire and rescue trapped guests. Of the 304 guests staying in the hotel, 119 lost their lives. About 65 were injured, and nearly 120 escaped the disaster. Members of the Weinkauf family, the owners of the hotel who lived in the building themselves, were among the victims of the fire. The fire had a profound impact on building regulations. In 1948, the rules governing emergency exits and hotel safety were rewritten, with a focus on the use of non-combustible materials, the installation of fire alarm and detection systems, the creation of safe escape routes, and consideration of building occupancy. These regulations later became known as the Life Safety Code, a set of rules that formed the foundation of many of today's building safety standards. No smoking. The Boeing 707-32 had a capacity of 124 passengers and had accumulated a total of 21,470 flight hours. The problems on Flight 82 began while it was en route from Sydney to Paris Orly Airport. After descending to 8,000 feet, 2,400 meters, a fire broke out in the aircraft's rear lavatory. The cabin crew moved toward the front of the aircraft and the emergency exits, as the smoke and fire quickly filled the rear of the plane. Before the emergency landing, some passengers had already died from smoke inhalation. The aircraft made an emergency landing in a field about 5 kilometers, 2.7 nautical miles, short of the runway. Of the 134 passengers and crew members on board, only 11 survived. Most of the survivors were seated in the front section of the aircraft or inside the cockpit. Several others were initially rescued alive, but later died from inhaling smoke and toxic gases produced by the fire. The probable cause of the accident was a lit cigarette discarded into the lavatory waste bin, which ignited its contents. Following the disaster, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration required the installation of no smoking signs in aircraft lavatories and mandated that passengers be informed of the smoking prohibition. Thanks for watching until the end. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos.